rated property. That's starting to widen as this legislative change comes through. And the other thing that we're starting to see, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, is people explicitly trying to do capital flips on some of these lower rated properties and see that big valuation improvement. We'll talk a bit more about that. But I think really striking is some of the Rightmove research on extent to which EPC ratings influence decisions to book a viewing. 75% of people saying yes, it does influence them, of which 22% say it would influence them significantly. And so really starting to be part of people's renting and purchasing behavior, really starting to drive some of that. And again, that's linked to what people expect about future saleability, and also what renters expect around the cost of running the property. Really interesting as well, and I think this was a really great chart from the research team at Rightmove on if the EPC rating would influence your decision, what's the lowest score you'd feel comfortable viewing, with 81% saying that they wouldn't look at properties that are below that EPCD. And so really the most immediate impact is going to be on EPCE properties from some of these legislative changes. The Fs and the Gs have already had an impact on pricing. A lot of landlords have made improvements to those properties in order to get them above minimum energy efficiency standards. But we're going to start to see that same behavior moving into EPCE properties and in turn into EPCD properties. And it's worth noting in the private rental sector in the UK, the average EPC rating is a D. And so as that becomes, as we get closer and closer to that 2030 deadline, we're going to start to see that behavior shifting and that number shifting a little bit to the left as well.
And just one comment, if you don't mind, Anna, me just jumping in on that slide, is I think the split between owners and renters as well, you can really see the different trend of how much more fussy renters are being. So they're basically saying if it's below a C already, you've already lost half your market. Even if it's not a legislative thing at the moment, you're already losing so many potential viewers. And when you go back a slide again, you can see how many people wouldn't book a viewing. They're not even going to consider a property at the earliest stage of their search if you're below that threshold. So yeah, exactly, just kind of advocating what Anna's been saying, that it's time to have those conversations now. If landlords wait, they're just massively decreasing their market. Thank you.
Exactly that. Thanks, Hannah. And starting to see that behavior flowing through to purchasing decisions as well, with EPC scores starting to affect the time to sell. 76 days on an EPCB, 89 days on an EPCF. And so really starting to see that impact flow through here as well. I think the other piece that's interesting to note is, and I alluded to this a minute ago, we're starting to see some investors and portfolio landlords who are actively seeking lower EPC homes, starting to price in the cost of those improvements and then retrofitting them to flip them. And at Domino, we did some work around this in the West Midlands, actually, with a portfolio landlord who ended up transacting on about 200 properties like this and seeing on average a 60% valuation improvement from specifically targeting low EPC and poorly maintained properties, investing in the retrofit, in some cases taking grant money toward those where tenants were eligible and flipping them with about a 60% average valuation gain. We're starting to see that behavior across the market. We're also seeing a lot of auction purchases that are going toward this kind of strategy. But really interesting as we start to see, the flip side of smaller or accidental landlords exiting the market and pricing starting to reflect EPCs. We're starting to see portfolio landlords saying, you know what, this is actually a good time for me to be buying and thinking about acquiring and flipping some of these properties. I think also we're spending a little bit of time on marketing for low EPC homes and how agents can help in demystifying this topic a bit. As we spoke earlier, about 98% of residents do understand EPCs to some level, but most people aren't experts, right? So how can you help guide them through this and really understand, what does this mean? Really interesting research around improvement information that would encourage 70% of people to view lower rated properties. And specifically, biggest impact from showing what the improvement options are with costs. You get that off of the EPC, you get it with more specificity off of a PAS 2035 retrofit assessment. And so again, would encourage people to think about doing that, because that'll also cover off some of the ventilation and mold risks that are obviously going to be top of mind for a lot of people as well. And as the decent home standard comes into the private rental sector in particular, that's one that's going to start to be top of mind for people. But again, clear demand for agents to educate on improvement options, energy saving features, running cost comparisons, performance, and grants. I think a few practical things to help homeowners. First is starting with the right survey. I spoke about this earlier, but if you take one thing away in terms of practical guidance for homeowners and landlords, it's starting with that full PAS 2035 retrofit assessment that will give a view on ventilation to avoid damp and mold risk as well, which an EPC doesn't. And it's a requirement for any grant money. And so anybody who's thinking about having grant funded works done is going to need that kind of quality mark there. Second big thing is to sense check the costs. Get independent costings of the contractor. We're still seeing in the market a lot of installers quoting at rates that just don't reflect how much costs have come down. I picked on solar panels a little bit earlier, just calling that out as a market where since the 70s, the cost of solar panels have come down by 99.9%. There are a huge number of suppliers in the market now, and we're still seeing a lot of installers quoting less educated homeowners and landlords, 10, 15, 20,000 pounds for work packages that really should be more like 5 to 8, maybe 9,000 pounds, depending on number of panels and size of the array. And so it really does pay to get a bit of independent verification on the costing. At Domino, we run a contractor cost database where landlords and homeowners can get a view of what the market price ought to be. It's worth looking at something like that just to make sure that you're getting value for money. And I think third really important thing is to use accredited installers only. On the survey side, the quality mark you want is PAS 2035. On the install side, it's PAS 2030. Choose installers who are certified to that level. Again, grant funding is only going to be eligible with installers who have that quality mark. And even if you're not applying for a grant, it's a good sense check of, is this somebody who is being audited by Trustmark, who's had to go through more rigorous off-gem audit processes and training? Is this somebody who's had to sign up to Construction Line Gold? You want to look for some of those quality marks to make sure that you're getting the proper level of workmanship and craft.
Anna, if you don't mind, I just want to jump in and just flag a question that's come in from Caroline. I think it's quite a good one. So a lot of the times when we talk about EPC, we talk about homes and maybe solar panels or things that are only relevant to, not flats, not apartments. Are there any different guidance that you would give to somebody who's an owner of a flat where they might have more restrictions on the types of changes they can make?
That is such a great question. Thanks, Hannah, for flagging that. So if you have a flat, you are more restricted. That's just the reality. And there are a few things that are going to be important to understand. One is, what is the wall construction of that flat? So if you have ring beam cavity wall, you can insulate the cavity wall in just that flat. No problem. It's going to be relatively inexpensive. That's kind of your best case. And so there we're looking at a couple £1,000, not a massive job. If that isn't the case, let's say we're in one of these beautiful Victorian mansion blocks and you have solid brick, you are looking at needing to either do internal wall insulation. Most people don't want to do that because you're losing some square footage and it can be 20, 30,000 pounds. Or you're needing to be a bit creative in totting up a few smaller interventions. What do those look like? Thermostatic radiator valves, smart home controls. I mentioned earlier that the new EPC methodology is going to reward some of those smart home systems more, and so worth putting those in. They're not massively expensive. You pick up a few SAT points toward your EPC, and looking at some in-home electric heating systems. And those can look like, I mentioned earlier, high heat retention storage heaters. Those are a good solution for some flats and are relatively inexpensive. It's going to be around £1,000 per unit. Or other electric systems, insulating the boiler, this kind of thing can make a big difference in flats. And once you add up maybe 3 to 4 of those kinds of lower cost measures, many flats will find themselves, just getting into the EPCC. Makes a big difference in terms of heat loss if you are in the middle of the block or if you're in the corner. And what we'll typically find is flats that are in the middle of the block are going to have a slightly higher EPC rating. Those that are on the corners are going to have lower ratings. You've just got more wall to lose heat through, and are going to find it harder to make that upgrade. And so if you are, advising on a purchase or on a sale, it's worth knowing whether or not, we're in the middle of the block or in the corner, because that'll change a bit how many degrees of freedom you have. But flats, certainly harder than homes. Big impact from the wall type. If they've got a cavity, no problem. You're probably filling the cavity and maybe that's job done. If they've got a solid wall, then it's going to be a matter of totting up some of those smaller interventions, maybe looking at an in-unit electric heating system, and hopefully getting yourself just to that EPCC. We talked a little bit earlier about value for money from different upgrades. Wanted to call out a few that are typically, biggest bang for the buck and tend to be the most inexpensive. Loft insulation. If the home hasn't had the loft insulated, or if it's been a while, and if a tenant has been storing things in the loft, or the homeowner has, and it started to degrade a little bit, topping that up can improve the EPC score actually pretty significantly, and it's one